Tonight, we reopening a story most of us have never really questioned, a story hidden in plain sight. Because somewhere along the long, slow path of history, people went from living in dim, smoky rooms with almost no openings to building homes filled with wide, bright windows. And the journey between those two worlds is far stranger, slower, and softer than you might expect. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. If you enjoy gentle walks through the quieter corners of history, don't forget to like this video. It helps the channel more than you know. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss new calm stories like this one. But most of all, I'd love for you to leave a comment below. Tell me this. What kind of window do you have in your room right now? Big? Small? Wooden? Modern? I'm curious what you're listening through as we step back in time. Alright, settle in. Because this is the surprisingly strange, quietly fascinating story of how windows, simple, everyday windows, slowly found their way into nearly every home. If you walk into any room today, the first thing your eyes tend to notice, almost without thinking, is the window. The light, the air, the quiet movement of the outside world framed by wood, stone, or metal. It feels so natural, so expected, that it's almost impossible to imagine a time when windows were not common at all. Yet for most of human history, the idea of having a transparent opening in a wall was far from ordinary. It was unusual, inconvenient, and sometimes even impractical. But the change didn't happen overnight. It crept slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, like the movement of light across a floor. To understand how windows became such a normal part of life, we first have to understand what life was like before windows existed as we know them. Long before the clear panels, wooden frames, shutters, or anything resembling the modern idea of a window, people lived in enclosed spaces that felt more like protective shells than living environments. Homes were built primarily to keep danger out, not to let pleasant light in. Light, after all, wasn't guaranteed to be gentle. Weather wasn't guaranteed to be mild. And fresh air was not always the gift we imagine it to be today. Most early structures, simple huts, small timber homes, or thick-walled dwellings, had openings that were not truly windows, but rather gaps. These gaps served only one purpose: ventilation. They were small, often little more than slits, and placed high on walls to let smoke leave the room without allowing too much cold air to enter. People cooked indoors, slept near their fires, and needed somewhere for the smoke to escape. The idea of a window as a place to look out through, or as a gentle source of light, was not yet part of daily life. These early openings were unglazed, of course. They had no covering except sometimes a bit of cloth, stretched skin, or latticework made from thin branches. They did not close tightly. When the weather shifted, the inside of the home shifted with it. Wind blew through easily. Rain sometimes drifted inside. In cold seasons, a draft filled the room constantly. The openings were necessary for survival, but inconvenient in almost every other way. Because of this, most people kept their living spaces dark. Light came only from the fire or from small openings during certain hours of the day. Life in such a home felt enclosed, intimate, and dim, almost like being inside a quiet, private cave. The idea that a wall could one day have a transparent pane allowing sunlight to flood the space would have seemed almost miraculous. As settlements grew larger, homes evolved into different structures: timber-framed houses, small stone cottages, and simple brick dwellings. But even then, openings remained modest. Walls needed to remain strong to protect against wind, weather, and cold. Cutting large holes through them would weaken the structure. So houses kept their walls thick, with only small slits or narrow holes providing the minimal air and light needed for daily tasks. It is here, in this dim and practical world, that the strange story of windows truly begins. You have to imagine the early household, a single room, perhaps two, a fire glowing quietly in the center or along one wall, smoke curling upward, finding its way through a narrow slit near the ceiling, shadows forming gentle shapes on rough wooden beams. Most of the room remains in soft darkness, even during the day. People worked by the light of the doorway, placing tasks near openings to see better. They sat close to the fire not only for warmth, but to see the objects in their hands. Children played near the brightest corner of the room, where the faintest sunlight managed to reach. It was a life shaped by necessity, not comfort. The first small step toward the idea of a window came from something simple: curiosity about light. People began to notice that the tiny slits in walls, though small, transformed the room's feeling when sunlight entered at the right angle. Even a thin line of light made dust sparkle softly in the air. Even a narrow glow made the room feel slightly more open, slightly less enclosed. This gentle shift was not dramatic, but it made an impression. Over time, homeowners began to widen these slits just a little, making them more than thin openings meant only for smoke. They became sources of daylight. Even then, they were still unglazed, still open to the elements, but they allowed more light inside. These widened openings also allowed more air, which made rooms feel less smoky and heavy. The earliest windows, if we choose to call them that, were simple improvements on practical openings, not inventions of comfort, but refinements of necessity. By the early medieval period, especially in European regions with colder climates, the concept of a window as a purposeful feature of a home began to take shape. Stone cottages built along village roads sometimes had small openings just large enough to allow a person to see outside without compromising the safety of the home. These openings could be covered with wooden shutters, rudimentary covers that closed tightly during cold weather and opened when the day was mild. Shutters were the first real symbols of control over light and air. With shutters, you could choose how much daylight entered. You could decide whether the room felt open or closed. It was still far from the transparent windows we know today, but it was a significant shift. A home could feel bright on purpose, not just by accident. Shutters came in many forms. Some were simple planks of wood hinged on one side. Others were fitted with small slots to let in a bit of air, even when closed. Wealthier households sometimes carved patterns into their shutters, letting thin lines of light enter the room in delicate shapes. When sunlight filtered through these carved patterns, it created a soft, dappled glow inside, one of the earliest decorative uses of light in the home. But still, the spaces remained heavily influenced by weather. A shutter, even a good one, could not keep out all the cold. On windy days, drafts slipped through easily. On rainy days, shutting the window meant darkening the entire room. And during storms, when shutters had to remain closed for long periods, people moved through their homes in dim, flickering firelight. The real transformation required something new, something that felt impossible for a long time, a material that allowed light to enter while still blocking wind, rain, and cold. Long before glass became common, other materials were experimented with. In some places, thin pieces of stretched animal skin served as coverings. These skins, scraped thin, allowed soft, diffused light to filter through. They were not transparent, but they made rooms brighter than plain wooden shutters. In other regions, slices of horn were used similarly, polished until they allowed light to pass through. These early translucent materials represented a quiet shift in thinking. People began to realize that walls could let in light without sacrificing protection. This was the earliest glimpse of the modern concept of a window. Yet these innovations were limited. Animal skins discolored over time and had to be replaced. Horn sheets were expensive and difficult to produce. Both materials distorted light significantly, making it impossible to see clearly through them. They served only for illumination, not visibility. For most households, these early coverings were impractical, and shutters remained the norm. The real turning point arrived slowly, across centuries, through gradual developments in the production of glass. But before glass could become common in windows, people had to learn to produce it consistently, shape it reliably, and afford it realistically. At first, glassmaking was rare, and glass objects were luxury items. Most pieces were small, uneven, and full of bubbles. Creating a clear, wide piece was beyond reach for a long time. Even when small glass panes first appeared in certain wealthier settlements, they were tiny, far smaller than anything we would consider a window pane today. They were often the size of a hand or smaller, fitted into wooden frames in groups. Some were circular, some square, some irregularly shaped because they were cut from imperfect sheets. They didn't offer a perfect view of the outside world. Instead, they created a mosaic of blurred shapes and soft colors. But they let in more consistent light than animal skin or horn. And most importantly, they allowed a room to remain bright while staying warm and protected. These early glass-covered openings were the first true windows in the modern sense. But they were far from common. Only the wealthiest homes had them at first. For most families, shutters remained the only realistic option. Still, the idea had been planted. A room could be naturally bright and protected at the same time. And so, over generations, the concept grew. People began to appreciate the calm comfort of sunlight filling a room without wind disturbing their rest. They noticed the way glass made homes feel less enclosed, less heavy, more open to the rhythm of the day. Even though early medieval homes still relied heavily on shutters, the appearance of glass, even in small forms, changed expectations slowly. Daylight was no longer merely something that entered through a crack or gap. It was something people sought intentionally, something they wanted to manage and control. The idea that a window could offer both beauty and practicality began to take root. This was the earliest phase of the strange, slow journey that brought windows from rarity to everyday familiarity, a journey that would continue through craftsmanship, climate, culture, and centuries of refinement. To understand how windows slowly became common, we first need to understand something subtle. There was a moment in history, a drawn-out, hardly noticeable moment, when people began to want light inside their homes. Not just tolerate it, not simply allow it, but genuinely want it. This desire did not come suddenly. It crept in quietly, generation after generation, shaped by changes in how people lived, worked, and imagined comfort inside their daily environments. For much of earlier history, the idea of letting in large amounts of daylight was unusual. Homes were built primarily to keep out weather, cold, and danger. Walls were thick because safety mattered more than brightness. A home was a shelter, not a place designed for visibility or aesthetic pleasure. But as communities grew more stable, and as the needs of daily life changed, people began to appreciate light in new ways. Life inside early medieval homes often revolved around the fire. When mornings were dim, the fire provided light. When evenings fell early, the fire guided people through their tasks. When seasons shifted, the fire stayed constant. Rooms were arranged around it. Daily routines followed its glow. In such a world, windows were simply not expected to provide brightness. They were small and functional, mostly for ventilation. But over time, the rhythm of life evolved. People began spending more time indoors doing tasks that required clearer visibility. Sewing, weaving, repairing items, writing, reading messages, sorting herbs, counting goods, preparing small crafts or tools. These tasks demanded light that didn't flicker or cast deep shadows. Candles existed, but they were made sparingly. They were precious, used for important moments or practical necessities, not for daily illumination. Lamps burned oil, which could be expensive. Firelight helped, but it shifted constantly and cast uneven light across surfaces. In such circumstances, the idea of daylight entering more freely, without smoke, without flicker, without the need for extra fuel, became quietly appealing. Still, homes could not simply widen their openings freely. Structural walls needed to remain strong. Weather remained unpredictable, but gradually, homeowners began to notice that slightly larger openings, just a little wider than the old ventilation slits, made certain tasks easier. As these openings widened, people experienced something new, a sense of calm that came from natural light settling gently over a room. It was not just practicality, it was atmosphere. Even without glass, even with shutters still serving as the main covering, the slowly increasing size of openings changed how people felt indoors. Rooms felt less closed. Morning light became a soft reminder of the day's beginning. Sunlight brought warmth in winter, easing the weight of cold stone walls. In summer, the ability to open shutters allowed fresh air to circulate more freely. This subtle shift, people noticing light as something comforting, was the true beginning of the story. As we move deeper into the medieval era, we see something even more interesting: the rise of communal activities that required better lighting. Workshops where several people worked together needed illumination to reduce mistakes. Market houses, storage areas, and communal kitchens needed visibility for safety and coordination. Larger buildings, barns, mills, weaving rooms, grain halls started incorporating more intentional openings. The change was slow, but you can trace it like a soft line across generations. First, small openings were slightly widened. Then shutters became more common. Then shutters were crafted more carefully, with better hinges and more secure closures. Then openings were carved with smoother edges, designed intentionally rather than improvised. Eventually, the idea of a window space became standard even before glass filled it. Life inside homes was evolving, but it wasn't just practicality guiding the shift. These spaces were beginning to reflect something new, a desire for comfort. In households where families gathered for evening tasks, where parents worked while children played nearby, daylight made the atmosphere calmer. It made the home feel less closed off, less reliant solely on firelight. People began subconsciously associating light with a more comfortable life, even if they didn't articulate it. At the same time, modest social changes were quietly shaping architecture. As small communities grew and travel routes improved, new ideas about living spaces spread from region to region. Builders learned techniques from other villages. Carpenters experimented with different styles. Stone masons refined how openings could be placed without weakening walls. These techniques spread slowly, carried by traveling craftsmen, merchants, and seasonal workers. With each shared skill, the concept of an intentional windowed space became more familiar. Still, the idea of transparent windows remained distant for average people. The existence of glass was known, but clear, flat, uniformly shaped glass remained difficult and expensive to produce. Early glass was clouded, uneven, and often too small to be practical. Even when small panes were used in certain privileged buildings, they were luxuries rather than common features. But the idea had entered the collective imagination. A room could be brighter without being colder. This imagination, even without technology ready to meet it fully, kept guiding subtle architectural decisions. One of the more fascinating shifts occurred in the daily habits of medieval households. As windows became more intentional, even as simple open spaces covered by shutters, people began rearranging their interiors to take advantage of these openings. Work tables were placed closer to the window. Storage moved further back. Looms and spinning wheels found positions where daylight touched the fibers more clearly. Meals were sometimes prepared near the brighter side of the room. The window began influencing the room's layout long before glass became common. This was a psychological shift as much as an architectural one. Homes were no longer thought of as completely enclosed places, but as spaces interacting softly with the world outside. A window, however simple, became a gentle connection between indoors and outdoors. People began opening shutters more often, not only for practicality, but for comfort. Sitting near the opening brought a moment of peacefulness. It allowed people to observe the weather, see neighbors pass, or simply enjoy a quiet breath of air. In the midst of daily work, this small contact with the outside world brought a sense of calm continuity. There is something deeply human about this shift. The desire for light, for a sense of openness, for a gentle connection to the outdoors. These are universal feelings. Even generations ago, in homes far dimmer than our modern ones, this desire was present, and it quietly pushed architecture forward. Another factor in the rise of more intentional openings was the increasing importance of shared living spaces. Medieval households often included extended family members, workers, apprentices, or helpers depending on the region and lifestyle. With more people living in one space, lighting became more essential. Crowded rooms felt less confined when light filled the space. Brightness softened the sense of close quarters. In time, windows stopped being seen only as practical necessities and began to represent a small form of improvement, an upgrade to daily life. Builders responded accordingly. Openings became more regular in size. Frames were crafted with more care. Shutters were designed to be sturdier and easier to open. Some households even began adding simple decorative elements around their window openings, not because the windows were luxurious, but because they were quietly appreciated. These changes didn't require glass. They required a new mindset, that a wall could hold a place for light. But behind these small shifts was another force shaping the future of windows, the slow, steady improvement of glassmaking techniques. Even though glass was rare and expensive, artisans worked for centuries to refine their craft. Each generation improved the clarity, uniformity, and usability of glass pieces. This innovation didn't happen quickly. It took patience, countless trials, and a growing interest in how transparent materials could benefit architecture. In some wealthier towns, a few buildings experimented with small panes set into wooden frames. They were often irregularly shaped, fitted into latticework. Even though these panes did not offer a clear view outside, they created a beautiful glow indoors. Sunlight, filtered through uneven glass, produced soft patterns on tables and floors. These spaces felt different, not merely functional, but quietly graceful. Such designs inspired others. Even families who could not afford glass sometimes imitated the look with wood carvings or horn panes. The fascination with light persisted. As we move further into the medieval and early modern periods, this fascination becomes the foundation for the next great evolution in window history. It is not the invention of glass itself that changes the world, but the growing desire for brightness, comfort, and connection. People began imagining homes filled with steady, gentle daylight. And once a society imagines something, even faintly, it slowly moves toward making it real. The desire for light created demand. Demand encouraged innovation. Innovation made new techniques possible. And these techniques gradually turned the window from a rare luxury into a necessary feature. But that next stage, the stage where glass began entering ordinary homes, required a great deal more than desire. It required craftsmanship, trade, affordability, and entire communities learning to work with fragile materials in ways they had never done before. It is in that world, full of slow progress and surprising breakthroughs, that the strange journey of windows continues. To understand how windows eventually became familiar parts of everyday life, we need to travel into one of the most delicate transitions in architectural history, the slow arrival of glass into ordinary homes. Today, glass feels like one of the simplest materials, transparent, predictable, everywhere. But hundreds of years ago, glass was unusual. It was fragile, difficult to make, expensive to transport, and even harder to form into shapes suitable for buildings. Yet despite all of these obstacles, it gradually found its way from workshops of skilled craftsmen into the hands of families all across Europe. This chapter is not about spectacular discoveries or sudden breakthroughs. It's about a long, quiet progression, like watching the sun rise slowly over a landscape, illuminating one field at a time. Because the story of glass windows is not dramatic. It is patient. It is shaped by craftsmen working carefully in warm workshops, by travelers carrying fragile items wrapped in cloth, by masons carving smooth edges into stone, and by ordinary people who, for the first time, saw sunlight pass gently through a material that could protect them from cold. The earliest forms of glassmaking were simple and limited. Glass was created by heating sand, ash, and minerals at extremely high temperatures. Achieving these temperatures required special furnaces and great experience. Only a few regions had the right materials and knowledge, and even then, early glass was far from clear. It had a faint greenish tint, it was uneven, full of bubbles, and rarely shaped into anything wider than a small cup or decorative bead. Craftsmen used glass mainly for jewelry, ornaments, or small containers. The idea of inserting glass into walls remained distant. But as glassmakers experimented across generations, they learned slowly to create wider, flatter pieces. These pieces were still imperfect, wavy, thick in some areas, thin in others, but they represented a shift. People began to imagine how this material could shape homes, not just decorate objects. The first major step in this direction arrived in the form of small circular glass pieces, often called bullseye panes by later historians. These circles were created by spinning molten glass into thin sheets. The center remained thicker, while the outer portions became thin enough to let in light. These circles were not intended to provide clear views. They distorted images significantly, but they let in more light than wood or horn, more consistently than simple openings, and more softly than direct sunlight. A wealthy household, or sometimes a community building, might place several of these circles in a wooden lattice, creating a kind of mosaic window. Seen from outside, these openings shimmered faintly when the sun touched them. Seen from inside, they filled the room with a soft, milky glow. Houses with such windows were rare, but they set a new aspiration, that a wall could hold light without losing warmth. The importance of these small panes wasn't just in their practical benefit. It was psychological. For the first time, people experienced what it felt like to have a space filled with daylight, even when shutters were closed against wind or rain. The experience was gentle, subtle, and soothing. It changed expectations. It made people long for more. As the desire for such comforts grew, glassmaking slowly advanced. Workshops in certain regions, particularly those near forests rich in wood for fuel or near sand with particular qualities, developed better techniques. Glassmakers learned to reheat formed pieces, flatten them, cut them into shapes, and grind edges. The work was delicate. The furnaces needed constant attention. The materials had to be mixed precisely. Even small changes in temperature could ruin weeks of effort. But even small successes spread quietly across markets. Merchants traveling between towns brought samples of glass items wrapped carefully in cloth. These items were so fragile that travelers often carried them by hand rather than placing them with other goods. They arrived in markets as curious objects, smooth, translucent, faintly colored pieces that caught the light in gentle ways. People admired them, and admiration began to shift into desire. Still, glass remained expensive. Even small panes cost more than many families could afford. And even if someone managed to purchase a pane, there were challenges. Glass had to be fitted into frames. It needed support. Walls had to be carved or adjusted to hold a wooden or lead grid that could protect the fragile pieces. These adjustments required craftsmen, carpenters, masons, glaziers. Every window was a project requiring planning, skill, and patience. But the idea persisted. Certain homes, those belonging to wealthier merchants or town officials, began adding small glass panes to their upper rooms first. These rooms were often used for reading, bookkeeping, sewing, or other tasks requiring delicate attention. These homes didn't yet have large windows, but the addition of a few small panes transformed the atmosphere. Workers inside these rooms found it easier to see their tasks. They felt less strain on their eyes. Letters could be written more clearly. Threads could be seen more distinctly. Meanwhile, in public buildings, meeting halls, counting rooms, and certain areas of religious architecture, glass also began appearing. These places needed reliable lighting for gatherings, discussions, or administrative tasks. Glass allowed sunlight to enter without exposing interiors to wind or dust. It made these spaces feel more dignified. Visitors often paused to admire the glow, not because it was extravagant, but because it felt quietly refined. This was the stage where glass stopped being viewed only as a curiosity and began to be seen as a useful building material. The spread of glass was also helped by improvements in transportation. As roads connecting towns improved, merchants found it easier to transport fragile goods. Breakage still happened, but better packing methods, smoother routes, and more experienced travelers reduced losses. More glass reached households. More people saw what it could do. Slowly, demand grew. At the same time, the prices of glass decreased gradually. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but consistently. As more workshops experimented with techniques, production became slightly more efficient. The availability of raw materials expanded. Processes improved. Glassmakers gained experience. All of these subtle improvements lowered the cost enough that moderately wealthy families could consider buying small panes for a few openings in their homes. But even these affordable windows were not like modern glass windows. They were small, often assembled in patterns held together by strips of lead or carved wood. They were uneven. They distorted shapes. They blurred the outlines of objects outside. But to a world accustomed to dim interiors, they were extraordinary. As glass filtered into homes, it brought with it new patterns of daily life. Rooms became arranged differently. Tasks that required better visibility moved toward windowed spaces. People began choosing to sit near windowed walls during the day, enjoying the gentle glow. Rooms with even small glass panes became preferred gathering places. The presence of light created a more welcoming environment. Over time, this shift in household preference encouraged builders to design walls with window spaces already planned, rather than cutting openings afterward. The placement of windows, still small, still modest, became part of architectural thinking rather than something added later. One of the most interesting changes brought by early glass was the shift in privacy. With shutters alone, homes either felt open or closed. There was no middle state. When the shutter was open, anyone passing by could see inside. When it was closed, the room felt dim and isolating. Glass changed this balance. Even imperfect, clouded panes allowed light in while preventing clear visibility from outside. This created a sense of comfort and modest privacy. Families appreciated this new balance. It made homes feel more like personal spaces rather than purely functional shelters. Another result of glass entering homes was the evolution of daily rhythm. When homes grew brighter, people found it easier to wake with the light. They aligned their morning routines naturally with the sun's rise rather than waiting for the fire to provide enough illumination. Patterns of work and rest shifted subtly. Rooms with glass became morning rooms, places where families prepared for the day's tasks. As these patterns took root, communities changed gradually as well. Workers found that artisans, tailors, scribes, weavers, benefited tremendously from steady natural light. Workshops with glass panes became known for better quality work. People preferred to bring tasks to these brighter spaces. Even small improvements in lighting made a noticeable difference in craftsmanship. This growing appreciation spread by word of mouth. Travelers visiting one town noticed homes with clearer, brighter rooms. They returned to their own villages with stories. Carpenters heard requests. Glassmakers received more orders. Builders began planning slightly larger openings. Openings that made more sense with the possibility of glass. The process was never uniform. Some regions adopted glass faster. Others held on to older traditions longer. In places where storms were frequent, shutters remained the most practical option for years. In mountainous regions where wind was strong, even small panes needed extra reinforcement. In warm climates, households sometimes preferred airflow over the limited clarity of early glass. But overall, across generations, the trend moved steadily. Glass was entering ordinary homes, one pane at a time. To appreciate this slow arrival, imagine a small medieval village of the 14th or 15th century. Early in the morning, sunlight filters into modest homes. Some homes have only shutters, which must be opened to let in light. Others have one or two small glass-covered openings. The rooms in these slightly brighter homes feel differently, not dramatically, but noticeably. There is a calm warmth, a softness to the light, a gentle blending of indoor and outdoor spaces. A traveler entering such a home might pause and comment, "Your room is bright," even if the opening was small. Such compliments encouraged families to save money for future enhancements. Builders, observing the trend, adapted gradually. A home designed for a family with a bit more wealth might include two openings intended to hold glass someday, even if the family only installed one at first. The idea of a windowed wall became more predictable. It became part of the language of architecture. This slow adoption of glass would eventually lead to the next major shift: larger panes, improved clarity, and more intricate frames. But that transformation required even more refinement in glassmaking, a craft that still had centuries of growth ahead. For now, in this chapter of the story, glass remained modest, delicate, and imperfect, but it was finally entering homes, not as extravagance, but as a gentle improvement in daily comfort. And with that arrival, the meaning of a window began to change forever. As glass slowly began to enter the lives of ordinary families, another transformation unfolded quietly and steadily, shaped not by glassmakers but by builders, carpenters, masons, and the many hands that carved, shaped, and assembled the walls of medieval homes. While glass was the material that made windows meaningful, the design of window frames, the shape of openings, and the way spaces were constructed around them played an equally important role in the long journey that made windows common. Before windows were something to install, they were simply holes in walls, practical openings cut wherever a builder thought necessary. Walls in earlier structures were thick, built for strength, warmth, and stability. Cutting a wide or precisely shaped opening into such walls was difficult and often risky. The wall might weaken, edges might crumble, or the structure might settle unevenly. So for many centuries, the safest openings were small and irregular, created with little more than basic tools and careful estimation. But as window glass became even slightly more available, even in small, circular, or uneven panes, builders began to change how they approached openings. They had to. Glass needed structure. It needed a frame. It needed support. And that requirement introduced one of the most quietly revolutionary ideas in architecture: the intentional window space. The frame itself quickly became one of the most important elements. A frame wasn't just a border, it was a support system. Builders needed to create an area that could hold not only the glass, but also the lattice, hinges, and shutters. It had to withstand wind, temperature changes, and the constant opening and closing that daily life demanded. These early frames were made from wood in most households. Carpenters carved them slowly, smoothing the edges, measuring angles carefully, and fitting each piece tightly into the surrounding wall. In wealthier homes or public buildings, stone masons carved window openings directly from the wall blocks. This work required precision. Too wide an opening risked weakening the wall. Too narrow meant reduced light and discomfort. Stone masons used chisels and hammers to shape the edges, leaving flat surfaces where wooden or lead frames could be installed. Often, the edges were slanted inward, a technique that allowed more light to enter. This small architectural decision, originally tied to practical challenges, would influence window design for centuries. Some of the earliest surviving windows from this era show deep frames made from thick wood placed within stone openings. The glass, small, uneven panes, was held in place by thin strips of lead or shaped wooden bars. These strips formed patterns, diamonds, squares, or gentle curves. Not because the craftsmen wanted decoration, but because using small pieces was easier than attempting one large pane. Beauty emerged from practicality. Inside the home, the presence of a framed window changed the entire feel of the room. Before frames, light entered as a simple beam, uncontrolled and often harsh. With frames and small panes, the daylight filtered into rooms more softly. It dispersed into gentle patterns on floors and walls. The atmosphere became calmer. People began to gather near these windows without thinking, settling nearby for reading, mending, or quiet reflection. This shift in daily behavior reinforced the builders' choices. It urged them to refine window frames further. Builders noticed that households appreciated light and used it intentionally. They responded by shaping openings more precisely. Some created double shutters, an inner and outer set, allowing families to control airflow and brightness more carefully. Others carved deeper recesses into walls so windows could be partially open without letting in too much wind. As frames improved, so did the alignment of windows with the architecture of homes. Early medieval houses were often built with little regard for symmetry, focusing instead on structure and protection. But as windows became more important, builders began to place them at more thoughtful heights and positions. A window placed too low let in cold air, too high, and it offered light but no visibility. Over generations, builders learned to position windows in ways that balanced all needs: light, comfort, privacy, and structural stability. One important development was the growing awareness of orientation. Builders began paying attention to the direction the home faced. Windows placed on eastern walls allowed warm morning sunlight to enter. Western windows caught the evening glow. Northern windows provided consistent but softer light, which was ideal for tasks requiring steady visibility. Southern windows brought brightness, but sometimes too much heat in summer. These considerations shaped how craftsmen built homes, though subtly and slowly. It was not architectural theory, it was lived experience, accumulated through observation. At the same time, carpenters experimented with different types of openings. Some created windows with tilting shutters, allowing the top part to open for light and ventilation without making the entire room drafty. Others added small hooks that held shutters at half-open angles. These details made life inside the home more comfortable. They also gave windows a social presence, making them more than static architectural features. They became adjustable tools for managing daily comfort. As these adjustments spread, windows began to influence not only interiors but the exteriors of homes. When a home had 2 or 3 windows placed with intention, it subtly altered its appearance. Houses no longer looked like heavy, enclosed blocks but began to develop faces, expressions shaped by the gentle presence of openings. Streets lined with such houses appeared more welcoming. Villages felt brighter. Material culture, slowly, quietly, was transforming. Meanwhile, the craftsmen themselves were evolving. Carpenters became familiar with specific measurements, chiseling techniques, and patterns used to hold small panes. Some began to specialize in window work. They learned how to carve narrow grooves into frames to secure glass. They experimented with different types of wood: oak for durability, pine for easier carving, and elm for flexibility. Each would behave differently when exposed to weather, and craftsmen learned to choose the right material for the right environment. Stone masons, too, refined their craft. Window openings carved from stone required precise angles and smooth surfaces. The masons developed new techniques to support the weight of upper walls. They learned to work with stone blocks that held their shape well under pressure. These details allowed openings to become slightly larger over time, letting in more light. And all of this happened quietly, without grand declarations or sudden revolutions. It happened through generations of builders teaching apprentices, apprentices learning through repeated practice, and families gradually requesting improvements as they experienced the comfort of even small windows. The presence of windows also influenced the internal layout of homes more dramatically than ever before. Rooms with windows became the center of daily tasks. Darker rooms were often converted into storage, while brighter ones became sewing rooms, reading corners, or gathering spaces. People positioned their best chairs near windows. They dried herbs on window ledges. They kept tools requiring visibility closest to light. The home's rhythm reorganized itself around this new relationship with daylight. Another interesting development involved seasonal window habits. In winter, windows stayed mostly closed, but shutters were eased open during midday when sunlight helped warm the interior. In summer, shutters were kept partly open to allow breezes in while keeping direct heat out. People began placing pots of herbs near windows to catch morning sun. Children often played near windows because the light made them feel cheerful and secure. In households with even a few small pieces of glass, new behaviors emerged. People looked outside more often, not in the way modern people gaze through clear panes, but in short, soft glances through blurry glass. They watched the weather, noticed the time of day based on light angles, observed passing neighbors as shapes and color rather than clear images. These glances created a sense of connection that older homes never offered. This connection, invisible yet deeply felt, was one of the quiet forces pushing windows toward becoming a common feature. People valued the feeling of openness, the gentle blend between indoor and outdoor worlds. Builders noticed this shift and responded by making window frames more regular and more durable. As demand grew, glaziers, the craftsmen who handled the delicate installation of glass, became more common. These glaziers traveled from home to home, carrying small panes wrapped carefully in cloth and straw. They brought tools for cutting glass, lead strips for binding panes together, and putty made from natural oils and powders to seal frames. Their visits marked a subtle moment of transformation for households, a shift from dark, shutter-based architecture to a gentler world shaped by light. Because glass was still fragile and expensive, glaziers often reused small leftover pieces. A window could consist of 10 or 20 tiny panes arranged artistically or practically. This mosaic style became one of the signature early medieval window designs. It was not born from artistic ambition. It came from using every available resource. Yet it created a distinct look, soft, glowing, slightly imperfect, that people grew fond of. Even after glass became slightly more affordable, the mosaic approach remained popular for years. Households liked the charm of small pieces fitted together. Builders enjoyed the ease of creating frames for modest panes rather than cutting space for larger ones. Glaziers appreciated the flexibility of fitting uneven pieces into custom patterns. Over time, though, as glassmaking improved and panes grew larger, windows became more recognizable to modern eyes. But that transformation would take many more generations. For now, in this era, the window was still a humble feature, a series of small experiments by skilled hands, shaped by necessity, desire for comfort, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. And yet, even in this modest stage, windows were becoming more than architectural details. They were shaping behaviors, influencing room layouts, changing lighting patterns, and creating emotional comfort in ways few people consciously recognized. The window was beginning its journey toward becoming a beloved part of the home, a journey guided not just by glass, but by the people who shaped the spaces around it. In the quiet work of builders, in the small decisions of masons, in the daily habits of families, the window was gradually finding its place. By the time small glass windows began appearing in more homes, Something subtle but deeply meaningful had already begun to change across villages, towns, and quiet countryside settlements. People were not only experimenting with the idea of having more light inside their rooms, they were learning how to live with that light. And this adjustment was not automatic. It reshaped daily habits, interior layouts, work routines, household chores, and even the quiet rituals of morning and evening. We often imagine that windows simply appeared, and life continued as usual. But the truth is that windows introduced an entirely new relationship between people and their homes. They altered how time felt indoors. They shifted where families gathered. They changed how households arranged their tools, furniture, and workspaces. They prompted new routines in cleaning, repairing, covering, and adjusting. All of these changes unfolded slowly, with each generation adopting new habits as windows became more familiar. To step into a home from this transitional period is to witness a world where windows were still special, precious enough to care for deliberately, yet practical enough to influence daily life. Imagine a modest household in the 14th or 15th century, one that has recently acquired 2 or 3 small glass windows set into wooden frames. These panes are not large. They are mismatched pieces, joined by thin strips of lead or wood. They distort the view outside, creating blurred shapes and softened colors. Yet in the morning, when sunlight touches these panes, the entire room glows softly. It feels different from the warm flicker of firelight. It feels steady, natural, and comforting. Families slowly began adjusting their routines around this new source of brightness. Most households woke early, often before the sun fully rose. Before windows, morning work took place near the doorway or by the fire, the only reliable sources of light. But with even a single window, morning routines shifted. People began performing their first tasks of the day near windowed walls. They gathered herbs or prepared tools by the soft gray light that filtered through fogged glass. Children sat quietly near the window while older family members prepared meals. The corner of the home with the best light became the preferred place to begin the day. As the sun rose higher, the room transformed again. The steady daylight revealed details that firelight had obscured. People noticed the texture of wooden beams, the woven patterns of baskets, the soft colors of cloth. Tasks that required precision, sewing, sorting, carving, writing, became easier. With windows, homes offered a consistent source of illumination throughout the day. This new reliability gradually changed the pacing of daily work. Tasks that once had to be rushed while the fire was strong could now be done with more calm and patience. Light became a steady companion rather than a brief visitor. But windows also brought responsibilities. Glass needed to be kept clean, or as clean as possible. Early panes were uneven, and dirt or soot from a nearby hearth easily dulled their glow. Families developed quiet routines of wiping glass with soft cloths, clearing corners where dust gathered, and checking frames for drafts. These small tasks were simple but necessary. Shutters, too, became part of daily rhythms. In the early morning, shutters were often opened gradually. At midday, if the sun was too harsh, shutters might be angled to direct light upward or downward. In winter, shutters were closed tightly during the coldest hours, then opened briefly to capture warmth. Families learned to adjust shutters as naturally as they tended the fire. One of the more interesting changes appeared in where people chose to sit. Households reconfigured their spaces so the most important tasks took advantage of natural light. Instead of gathering near the fire during daytime hours, families moved toward windowed corners. Chairs or stools were placed strategically. Workbenches were shifted closer to openings. Even small items like scissors, bowls, or bundles of herbs were stored near windows so they could be used conveniently. This subtle rearrangement of furniture and tools mirrored something deeper. People were beginning to treat light as a household resource, not simply a natural phenomenon. Windows also changed how people perceived the outdoors. Before windows, the inside world and outside world were separated by thick walls, with the doorway serving as the primary connection. With glass panes, people experienced the outside gently, as soft shapes and movements filtered through the window's surface. They saw the sky shift in color. They watched silhouettes pass by. They noticed birds landing near the ledge or branches moving in the wind. This softened connection with the outdoors enriched daily life in ways that were not dramatic but quietly meaningful. Children learned to recognize weather patterns by the quality of morning light. Adults could gauge the time of day by the way shadows moved across the room. Even without a clear view, glass offered a sense of openness that had long been missing inside early medieval homes. For the first time, people were able to sense the day unfolding without stepping outside. These changes, however, varied depending on region, climate, and social standing. In colder regions, windows remained smaller for longer. In warmer climates, households experimented with slightly wider openings. In towns, glass became more common earlier than in rural villages. Yet across all these variations, families developed unique habits that shaped how they used their new windows. One common habit involved using window ledges. The deep recess created by thick stone walls offered a stable, cool surface. People began placing items there: dried herbs to catch soft sunlight, wooden bowls, candles that needed to set, small tools drying after cleaning. Window ledges became mini workspaces, storage areas, or quiet resting spots for small objects. Children often enjoyed sitting on window ledges, especially if a cushion or folded cloth was placed there. The view outside, even when blurred, was enough to entertain them as they listened to stories or waited for meals. In some homes, window ledges became places for reflection. Older family members used them for quiet moments, watching the shifting colors of the sky or the movement of leaves. The presence of natural light made these moments peaceful and grounding. Another significant behavioral change was the use of window light for determining time. Before clocks became common, people relied on the sun, shadows, and routines. With windows, the movement of light across a floor or wall created natural markers. Families learned to recognize when morning work should shift to midday tasks or when evening preparations should begin. In homes with multiple windows, different walls became indicators of different times of day. Light, once elusive indoors, became a subtle timekeeper. Windows also influenced cleaning habits. As homes grew brighter, dust became more visible. A home illuminated by a window revealed layers of soot, fine particles on shelves, or fibers on cloth. Families responded by sweeping more regularly, wiping surfaces more frequently, and maintaining tidier living spaces. This was not because people suddenly cared more about cleanliness. It was because windows made small details visible in ways firelight never did. Daily life became more orderly because daylight revealed what needed attention. One of the most practical changes involved food preparation. Before windows, kitchens were often dim spaces where the fire's glow provided the primary light. With windows, even small ones, households could sort grains, cut vegetables, or mix ingredients with greater accuracy. Mistakes decreased. Cooking became safer. Recipes passed down through families gained consistency. Windows quietly improved the quality of meals simply by allowing cooks to see their hands clearly. As windows spread, people also developed habits for protecting glass. They closed shutters tightly during storms. They avoided hitting the glass when carrying tools or bundles. They tied cloth across window frames during harsh winds to prevent rattling. When children played near windows, parents gently reminded them to be careful. Glass became something worthy of care, a valued addition to the home. Interestingly, windows also introduced a new concept of privacy. Before glass, privacy meant closed shutters, which resulted in a dark room. With glass, even imperfect glass, privacy gained a gentle intermediary form. People could keep their shutters open slightly during the day, allowing light in without feeling fully exposed. This balance shifted how people interacted with their communities. They could sense life outside without inviting it in. They could be aware without being visible. This quiet balance made homes feel more peaceful, more controlled, and more personal. Windows also influenced seasonal routines. In spring, people celebrated the return of bright mornings by opening shutters wider. In summer, windows allowed breezes to pass through, cooling rooms naturally. In autumn, people adjusted their shutters to capture the last warmth of the season. In winter, windows became treasured sources of brightness during short days, offering comfort even when cold air pressed against the walls. The rhythm of daily life, and even seasonal mood, became tied to the window. As all these habits accumulated, windows became more than additions. They became expectations. Households began planning new rooms around where light would fall. Builders created deeper recesses, sturdier frames, and better placements. Carpenters designed furniture inspired by window corners. Families began saving money specifically for future window upgrades. The window had become a quiet part of home identity, shaping how people thought about comfort. By the time the next chapter of history arrived, when glassmaking improved enough to allow larger panes, the world was already prepared. Families had built routines around window light. Craftsmen had learned to shape walls with intention. Communities had experienced the emotional and practical benefits of brighter rooms. Daily life had already been permanently altered. Windows were no longer an experiment. They were becoming a quiet necessity, one that would soon reshape architecture, culture, and the modern idea of home. As windows gradually found their place inside homes, another quiet transformation was taking place in the world outside. Among the craftsmen whose hands shaped the materials, built the frames, polished the glass, and learned the delicate techniques required to bring more light into people's lives. These craftsmen were not famous. Their names were rarely recorded, yet they guided one of the most subtle but meaningful architectural evolutions in history. To understand how windows became common, we must step into their world. The glaziers who shaped fragile glass, the woodworkers who carved precise frames, the lead workers who crafted the lattice that held tiny panes together, and the masons who carved openings that could withstand storms and time. Their efforts, quiet, repeated, perfected over generations, are what made the story of windows possible. The work of a medieval glazier was very different from what we imagine today. Glass was not delivered in large sheets. It was not flat, uniform, or predictable. Instead, glaziers often traveled with small bundles of irregular pieces, each one wrapped carefully in cloth or straw. These pieces varied in size, shape, thickness, and clarity. Some were cloudy, some were wavy, some had tiny air bubbles frozen forever inside. The glazier's job was to make sense of this unpredictable material and turn it into something useful. Their workshops were usually small and simple. A glazier might have a wooden bench, a few sharply angled blades for cutting glass, small iron tools for trimming edges, lead strips that could be shaped into thin lines, and a pot of thick putty made from natural oils and powders. The glazier learned to handle glass not by force, but by understanding its fragility, feeling how much pressure a piece could tolerate, sensing the line along which it wanted to break, and guiding the cut gently rather than forcing it. Most early panes were cut into small shapes by necessity rather than design. The glass itself dictated its own limits. A glazier might sit at the bench with a small pane in hand, testing its edges, rotating it slowly, and deciding where to trim. Then, with deliberate care, they would score a faint line onto the glass. The scoring tool did not cut deeply. It simply created a surface weakness. With a practiced motion, the glazier would apply pressure along that line, encouraging the piece to break cleanly. This process required patience. Sometimes the glass cracked incorrectly. Sometimes a piece shattered entirely. Each mistake meant starting again with a new piece. Because glass was expensive, glaziers learned to waste as little as possible. Even fragments were saved. They might serve as parts of smaller windows or decorative features in wealthier homes. After pieces were cut, they were arranged on the bench like puzzle fragments. The glazier measured the wooden frame or stone opening where the pane would be installed, then began assembling the pieces into a pattern. Lead strips, soft, malleable, easy to bend, were shaped around each piece. These strips held the glass securely and acted as borders, giving the window its distinctive lattice appearance. The glazier pressed the panes into the soft lead, adjusted angles with small wooden tools, and trimmed the strips to fit perfectly. The finished piece, often made of many small panes joined together, was then sealed with putty. The putty filled gaps, strengthened edges, and protected the pane from drafts. The drying process took time. Only after the putty hardened fully could the window be transported. This slow, methodical labor shaped the earliest window designs. And because glaziers traveled widely, moving from village to village, their techniques spread gradually across regions. A glazier visiting one town might share a new cutting method or demonstrate how to shape lead strips more effectively. Apprentices watched closely, learning through repetition. Over time, a shared language of craftsmanship developed, an unspoken understanding of how glass should be handled. While glaziers worked with glass, woodworkers dedicated their skills to creating frames sturdy enough to hold it. Medieval window frames were often simple in appearance but complex in construction. They had to fit snugly into stone or timber walls, resist wind, and support both shutters and glass. A carpenter began by selecting wood carefully. Oak was strong and durable, ideal for outer frames. Pine was softer, easier to shape, and used for inner fittings. Elm offered flexibility, useful when more intricate carving was needed. The carpenter first measured the opening created by the mason. This opening was rarely perfect. Walls shifted slightly as they settled. Stone edges were often uneven. So the carpenter shaped the frame to match the irregularities of the wall rather than forcing the wall to match the frame. This approach required patience. The carpenter shaved wood carefully, testing the fit repeatedly until the frame slipped into place smoothly. Next came the carving of grooves, thin, precise channels carved into the frame. These grooves held the lattice of lead and glass. They needed to be just wide enough to accommodate the pane, yet tight enough to hold it securely. Carving grooves by hand demanded steadiness. A slight misalignment could cause the pane to rattle in the wind or shift with time. Carpenters developed a sense of touch for this work, running their fingertips along the groove to test depth and smoothness. Once the grooves were ready, the frame was sanded, polished, and sometimes treated with oils to protect the wood. Then it was placed into the wall's opening and secured with wooden wedges, iron nails, or small bolts, depending on the region's building traditions. Around the frame, the mason would add finishing touches, filling small gaps with mortar to keep out drafts. The work of a lead worker was equally important. They shaped the thin strips that held glass pieces in place. These strips needed to be flexible yet strong, soft enough to mold, but firm enough to withstand years of use. Lead workers heated lead gently, flattened it into narrow ribbons, then shaped it around glass. They used small iron tools to press the strips into place. Their work required steady hands, especially when assembling larger windows. A single mistake could distort the entire pattern. As these craftsmen refined their skills, windows slowly improved. Panes fit more securely. Frames held stronger. Lattices became more symmetrical. Designs became cleaner and more even. Homes that once had dim, uneven windows began to enjoy steadier light and better insulation. But perhaps the most interesting part of this slow evolution was how craftsmen communicated and shared their knowledge. There were no formal schools for glaziers or window makers in most regions. Skills were passed down through apprenticeship. A young apprentice watched the master work for months before being allowed to handle a tool independently. They learned not only techniques, but rhythms. The rhythm of working slowly, of respecting fragile material, of understanding that windows required patience. Traveling glaziers also brought new ideas. They visited villages, repaired old windows, installed new ones, and shared their methods with local craftsmen. A technique learned in one region might spread quietly along trade routes and appear in another region decades later. In this way, window craftsmanship grew like a slow-moving river, expanding steadily but gently. Another factor influencing craftsmanship was demand. As more households saw the benefits of windows, they requested them more frequently. And as demand increased, craftsmen refined their methods to work more efficiently. Some began preparing standard-sized frames that could be adjusted to fit different openings. Others experimented with slightly larger panes when glass quality improved. A few even began designing decorative patterns, simple floral shapes or geometric designs that softened the appearance of the lattice. In time, window making became a recognized trade. Communities came to rely on glaziers for repairs, especially after storms or harsh winters. Wooden frames warped over time and needed replacement. Putty dried and cracked, allowing drafts. Lead strips loosened and required reinforcement. A home with windows needed maintenance, and craftsmen provided it. This ongoing relationship between craftsmen and households made windows feel more like part of daily life rather than rare luxuries. Families grew accustomed to the glazier's visits, much like they were accustomed to the blacksmith or cooper. A repaired window was seen as a sign of a household taking care of its comfort and well-being. Craftsmen also played a quiet but significant role in teaching families how to care for their windows. They explained how to open shutters gently so as not to disturb the glass. They taught how to clean panes using soft cloth moistened with warm water. They advised families to avoid placing heavy objects too close to the frame during cold seasons when wood contracted. These small lessons helped households treat windows not as delicate ornaments, but as everyday tools requiring care. Even in public buildings, the involvement of craftsmen shaped how windows functioned. Meeting halls installed larger frames. Community kitchens improved ventilation through small, strategically placed windows. Workshops relied on glaziers to create bright spaces where artisans could work efficiently. Each completed window contributed to a growing culture of indoor brightness. The glaziers and woodworkers who guided this slow perfection of window making rarely received credit in the historical record, yet they transformed how people lived. Their work introduced a new relationship with light, one built on precision, patience, and collaboration across different trades. Every pane, no matter how small, represented a chain of hands. The glassmaker who formed the material, the glazier who shaped and assembled it, the lead worker who held it together, the carpenter who carved the frame, and the mason who prepared the opening. A window was never the work of one person. It was a collective achievement, a quiet cooperation aimed at improving comfort within the home. By the end of this long period, windows were no longer rare. They were becoming expected. A home without windows felt outdated. A room without a window felt incomplete. Craftsmen had created not just objects, but habits, new ways of living with light. Their legacy was not proclaimed loudly. It was felt in the gentle glow of morning sunlight entering homes across countless villages, in the comfort of rooms that were no longer dim, and in the growing notion that a well-built home should welcome light rather than shut it out. Through their steady hands, windows became part of life, a simple, quiet necessity shaped carefully over centuries. Thank you for drifting with me through another quiet corner of forgotten history. The story of how windows became common is not dramatic or loud. It's gentle, steady, and shaped by countless small decisions made across centuries. Yet it reminds us how even the simplest things around us were once rare, fragile ideas that took time, patience, and many careful hands to become part of everyday life. If this calm journey helped you relax or kept you company tonight, don't forget to like the video. It really supports the channel. And if you'd like more slow, soothing stories from the softer side of history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story surprised you the most? The craftsmanship, the slow spread of glass, or how daily life changed with light? Leave a comment below. I always enjoy reading your thoughts. Rest well, sleep peacefully, and I'll see you in the next quiet chapter of history.